Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Alexander. I'm the CEO of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund right here in Washington, D.C. It's the place where we honor the men and women who have died in the line of duty, and we try to tell their story right here at the museum. I'd like to welcome you today to today's program, Policing Hate Crimes, Expanding Definitions of the Violence of Hate. Over the last decade, reported hate crimes in the United States have steadily been on the rise. In the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, the number of reported hate crime incidents committed against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community continue to rise at an especially alarming rate. In addition, over half of the total reported hate crime incidents were committed against either Black or LGBTQ+ individuals. These startling statistics describe only a portion of the hate crime incidents which occur in this country each and every year. Because while some states do report hate crime incidents, there remains no federal requirement to do so. 25 years ago, Matthew Shepard was the victim of an anti-gay hate crime in Laramie, Wyoming. Matthew was brutally attacked by two men and driven a few miles outside of town where he was left to die. He succumbed to his injuries on October 12, 1998. And his parents, Judy and Dennis Shepard, subsequently created the Matthew Shepard Foundation in his honor. The Matthew Shepard Foundation helped with the passage of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009, which expanded existing federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's perceived gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Today, our esteemed panel will discuss the ways that the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act in 2009 has impacted the policing of hate crimes in the United States, as well as the ways that law enforcement officers around the country and community stakeholders are supporting their communities when hate incidents occur. But before we turn it over to our panel, we will hear some opening remarks from Judy and Dennis Shepard, the parents of Matthew Shepard, about their experience as the family of a hate crime victim and the work that they are doing with the foundation that is fulfilling their son's legacy 25 years after his death.
It's been 25 years, a quarter century now, since Matt was taken from us. And as you look back and you think about what happened and how law enforcement responded, what did law enforcement do that was particularly helpful for you from the beginning of this tragedy?
Well, in the beginning, we were just trying to get to Matt, right? We didn't have any connection with law enforcement until Rob Debris and another deputy, I think, came to Fort Collins to meet us and to see Matt and to take in the condition that he was in while at the hospital. They didn't have much to tell us at the very beginning, but what struck me the most was they were so kind and empathetic, understanding of the difficulty we were facing with the additional press and all the nonsense going on around the crime itself. They were, I think, disappointed that they really didn't have everything sewn up, by then. But what struck me the most was they were so kind because I was not expecting it. In the past, crimes against the gay community have been treated with not much understanding.
And disdain.
And disdain, exactly. So that really did strike me as a positive beginning.
Mm-hmm. Did they provide you with essentially 24-hour access to them to be able to get questions answered?
Oh, sure. Yes, they did. Well, for several reasons. If we had questions, but also to update them on Matt's condition. So they did definitely do that.
Because I think that's one of the things that's really important for victims, especially if you've never had any contact with the criminal justice system, is it's complicated. It's for some people very scary, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so being able to have a point of contact, an actual human with a phone number that you can contact, I imagine was really important to you both.
No, it really was. But remember, this is an incident in Wyoming where nobody really lives, right? So maybe that was a benefit to us. If it were in a larger city, that is hard to accomplish. They also had no experience.
Right.
Very little experience with this sort of high-profile crime, and particularly against the gay community. So doubly challenging for them, maybe because it was so small.
how can law enforcement prepare? I mean, what should law enforcement agencies be doing today to prepare for a tragedy in any subcommunity? But in this case, we're talking about the LGBT community. It strikes me that you can't wait until something happens to try to figure it out. So what's your advice for law enforcement? What should they be doing today?
Well, as Judy has said, that a quote she heard somebody say in law enforcement, "Know me before you need me." And it goes both ways. Law enforcement needs to go out to the various groups within the community, various marginalized communities or whatever it might be, and get to know them. Law enforcement as a whole, not just a couple of individuals, but if you can have more than one, it's an advantage. So that law enforcement is comfortable going in and asking questions and talking to these people, and it's also on the other side, the community starts feeling comfortable about going to law enforcement when there is a problem.
If law enforcement makes the effort to meet the community leaders, it already establishes a level of respect, I think.
And trust.
And yeah, and that they took the time. But every marginalized community has its own language, right? Its own way to talk about things. And liaison officers in police departments are critical, to have someone who goes to their events, maybe even on off hours, participates in pride events, and so that they show respect for the community and the community will respect them.
There's also an important effort that needs to be made after hate crime too, to recognize and address the needs of the sort of the secondary victims. You know, the unique thing about hate crimes is that they impact not only just the immediate direct victim, but all of the members of that victim's identity group. And they instill a lot of fear. What kinds of things do you think law enforcement should be doing after a hate crime happens to help restore some sense of safety and security within that subcommunity?
Well, that's a tougher question. Well, if you started out with someone already familiar with the community, it becomes easier, I guess. But if you're just very beginning, it's hard to get them to trust you. And there is an issue of trust for law enforcement right now, particularly in the gay community, because of differing ideologies about what the gay community is, and a lack of familiarity and knowledge. Ignorance is our enemy, right? So it's that is harder. Establishing a level of trust again. Re-victimization is a big fear. The gay community, if you live in a state where you can be fired for being gay, getting them to talk about it is really, really difficult. And I think every community is going to be different. The response would be different and further actions would be different. I think personally, it's the same story. Just get to know them. Make an effort, make a bigger effort to become familiar with the community, and be kind and patient because they're afraid of you. They are afraid of you. We know the actual investigations for hate crimes are more involved and take longer. So that keeping the community and as well as the victim and family updated is really important. There's a need of the community to get answers and solutions, and it just takes more time with the hate crime.
Yeah, for sure. And you touched on transparency being such an important piece of all of this, but you also talked about trust. I mean, you can't wait to build trust with a community after something bad happens.
Right.
That trust has got to be worked on constantly throughout. And I think we know that in studying community policing and procedural justice, that's a central theme to both of those, but we have to engage in that constantly, for sure.
Well, part of the problem with that is you have two problems with that. One is training, which impacts the budget and the staff, who is going to be trained. And then you have turnover in your staff, and you have to continue to train and retrain because you may have trained them once, but they will forget, and you need to re-emphasize and reinforce all the time. But you have to be training everybody all the time, and it's a killer on a budget, especially if you're a small department.
Right. Well, and that's a great point because training isn't required for hate crimes across the country. And fortunately, they don't happen every day. And so if they're not on the front of your mind, you could go to an investigation and completely overlook one. I remember Dave O'Malley talking about the fact that they had this case pretty wrapped up within 48 hours, which is remarkable. And then there were 2 trials that you all endured. What did the prosecutors do in particular that you felt was supportive that you would recommend to other prosecutors who are working with families of hate crime victims?
Well, in our case, because Matt died, the prosecutor felt he had to have the discussion about the death penalty with us. He wanted to test our feelings about that before he decided to pursue it or not. And he discussed with us everything they were going to do during the actual trial. He said, the worst thing I can do for you and the trial at large is for you to be surprised by anything. So he kept me informed on 99% of the things that were going to be brought up in trial, so I wasn't surprised. Also, some direction for Dennis was still overseas during the actual trials, so I had a person with me, a support system with me to, take care of me, watch out for me, protect me from the media. Everybody just was very kind and very cognizant of how hard it was for us to be there. So we were informed about everything. Again, the word transparency absolutely described how the prosecuting attorney treated me in trial prep. They asked me questions. I was in contact with them all the time, getting ready for both trials.
Let's shift a little bit. One of the things that happened after this event was that you created the Matthew Shepard Foundation. And one of the greatest accomplishments, I think, that no one can argue about is the passage of the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. It's coming up almost on 15 years. It's hard to believe that it's already been 15 years, but talk about why that was so important as a priority for the foundation and your work.
Well, when Matt was killed, there were no hate crime laws, actually still aren't hate crime laws in the state of Wyoming. So it would have been very helpful if federally they could have helped law enforcement in Laramie and Albany County investigate and help pay for the investigation. They actually had to furlough officers to fulfill their budget because they had no money to do the investigation. And if there had been a federal law for the gay community, that could have been averted. So it was critical for the gay community at last to have some protection, right? But it also expanded existing laws, expanded the boundaries, the protocol, all those things, because everybody recognized that the hate crime law in the civil rights era just wasn't broad enough. The murder of James Byrd Jr. illustrated that as well. So it was very important. And we heard after the bill was signed how important it was going to be for not just the federal government to be able to do it, but all the local agencies who'd been clamoring for something to help them investigate hate crimes against the gay community. They already were collecting statistics regarding hate crimes against the gay community. Well, what were they going to do with those statistics? They knew that those crimes happened, so why not issue some kind of protection? It was absolutely brilliant. And the first time federal legislation was passed that actually was going to help the gay community rather than take things away, which I think was just absolutely brilliant.
And what it did to expand it in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was just race, religion, national origin. The Shepard-Byrd Act expanded that, even though it's only for hate crimes, into gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, and perception that you're something that you're not, as well as it expanded it to make Jews recognizing Jews as a race, where the 64 Act was only as a religion. Plus, it also gave the right for the federal government to come in and investigate if the state or city refused to do so on what they think was a serious hate crime. They could take over the investigation, and that was a critical thing to push hate crimes forward.
I think it was the only time that all the law enforcement agencies, or 90% of them, actually encouraged passage of
And
this
supported.
bill. Yeah, for years they supported it.
Well, and for states like California that has very inclusive hate crime laws, there's a lot of service and support that comes with this bill too. It's not just the ability to prosecute, but it's access to federal resources like something as simple as a crime lab that a small agency may not have or have access to. So it's really important. One of the things, though, that the Shepard-Byrd Act didn't cover was mandated reporting. And we still have a big gap in collecting data in this country around the hate crimes that are happening. Can you talk a little bit about that problem and what you see as a solution?
Well, that was one of the major flaws of the bill, is it didn't require reporting. Reporting is important because if you don't know where the problem is, you don't know where to put your resources. We understand that initially when hate crime numbers go up, that the public may really wonder about what's happening in their community. But what they don't understand is now their community knows where to put the resources to try to address the problem before it actually becomes a problem. It's just critical. And when you say major cities have no hate crimes, that's just ridiculous. We know they happen all the time. And even in Wyoming, where it's like nobody lives there, there can't be hate crimes. Yes, there are. There's a reservation in Wyoming. There's been hate crimes here forever. They just don't want to recognize that all crimes are hate crimes. Well, that's nonsense. But it's important to know where they're happening so that you can address it and put resources toward it. We understand cities don't want to be known as the hate crime capital of the US, but the initial numbers have to be there to know how to fix the problem.
And then they decline, and then somebody else becomes a hate crime capital. Because it's not only training law enforcement and prosecution, but it's also training the general public so they know what a hate crime is and they know where to go if there is a problem that they think might be a hate crime. So it's educating both sides of the issue so everybody can work together to resolve these.
So let's get all the states to have the same hate crime laws that cover all the communities rather than this patchwork stuff that's happening right now. And get help from the federal government. It's a no-brainer to me. And training was also not part of the bill, which is critical for officers, but also the community. If they don't understand the process, then there's going to be a lot of questions and hard feelings.
We agree that training is really important. And the Matthew Shepard Foundation has graciously made access to this training available. I mean, I think that's a big part of what the foundation's mission is right now as well, is to make this training accessible to any law enforcement officer in the nation. Okay, so MatthewShepard.org. You can also go to outtoprotect.org and find information about online hate crimes and investigations training that are available to any law enforcement officer in the nation at absolutely no cost, because the foundation is providing a full scholarship for that. You also mentioned the LGBT liaisons, the community liaisons, as being important for establishing relationships and trust. And the Matthew Shepard Foundation is also providing full scholarships for that training. So at least in my mind, there's really no excuse for a law enforcement agency around budget to not provide that training.
I agree. I totally agree. And I hope everyone takes advantage of it.
Judy and Dennis Shepard, thank you so much for spending your time with us on this 25th year commemoration.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you to the Shepards for spending some time with us. But we have an amazing panel of experts from across the U.S. here to share their knowledge with you around hate crimes. And so let's not waste any time and jump right into it. Brendan, let's start with you. Hate crimes aren't new. They're not a new problem here in the U.S., but in your study, what have you observed in terms of trends throughout the history of hate crimes, and what's important for law enforcement to know about that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So there's a couple of things there for me. So first, you're absolutely right that the hate crimes in America are not a new problem. The problem of intergroup violence has a long history of America, and I think it's something that we always need to be thinking about when contextualizing these crimes. That said, I think it's also important to point out that, like, within the landscape of American jurisprudence, like, hate crimes as a legal construct are relatively new. And I think this speaks to some of the things that the Shepard family were pointing out, in the sense that, like, in the first state hate crime laws started coming out in the early 1980s and then sort of trickling from there. And that means that we have this sort of lingering misconception, both at the victim level, at the agency level, about some of the definitional ambiguities surrounding hate crime laws. In terms of trends, I think that's always a difficult thing to talk about when we're talking about hate crimes, because it's a lot of the data and measurement issues that we've highlighted to this point. But in general, I would sort of highlight two things. So first, there's a general reluctance. This is really well established in the literature among many hate crime victims to report hate crimes to the police in the first place. And in our research, we see some evidence that pattern might be getting worse among some victims. And then second, and we sort of touched on this already, even when hate crimes are reported, some of the incidents aren't being officially recorded as such. So some of that's probably due to lack of evidence and unfounding and things like that. But we also identify sort of 3 patterns that are directly a product of that lack of a federal mandate at the agency level in our research. And that's, there's some agencies that are really good at it, like that report hate crimes every year, that have some kind of, institutionalized structure for identifying and reporting hate crimes. There's a portion of agencies that we sort of define as like institutionally defiant, that just don't, there's that 3,000 or so agencies don't report anything. And then there's like this middle ground where we have agencies that are reporting hate crime statistics under the Hate Crime Statistics Act every year, but over and over, year after year, quarter after quarter, universally reporting zeros. And I think that is in particular a problem that we can target through, changing institutional policies, training, and things like that. And we see some evidence that sort of pattern is getting slowly better. But I think those are the 2 trends that I would highlight.
Well, and Judy mentioned that there's really a patchwork of laws that you alluded to as well around the country. But what generally speaking, if a state has a hate crime law in place, what are the identity groups that are most commonly included?
Yeah, great question. So, first, like you mentioned, there are 3 states that don't have any hate crime laws at all: South Carolina, Arkansas, and Wyoming. Indiana is kind of a gray area, depending on who you talk to. They technically have a hate crime law, but they don't enumerate any categories. And so some people have tried to frame that as very inclusive. Other people, ADL, for example, agencies don't recognize it as a hate crime law at all. Among those remaining 46 states, essentially every one of them protects race, religion, ethnicity, national origin in some capacity. And then after that is when you get into sort of the variation across subgroups. So a small majority of states that protect sexual orientation and gender, and then a non-trivial minority that protect gender identity, age, disability. And then, I know that some lawmakers have even argued that patchwork, like including gender, can be extended to gender identity in certain states, even if gender identity isn't enumerated. And then you have a handful of states that sort of protect other categories. So like I'm talking to you right now from Florida. We protect the Florida laws, that they don't protect gender identity, but they do protect homelessness. And then a couple of Louisiana, for example, protects law enforcement. So really is a patchwork, and that's exactly how I would describe it. I think one of the most important things there that we're seeing in our research in terms of addressing some of the patchwork issues and the issues in compliance that I've already highlighted is exactly what you were talking about with the Shepard family earlier, and that's the need for training. So we see that some of those things are getting better the more training we have, at least at the state level.
Yeah, well, and that's why the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act is so important. President Obama signed that into law back in 2009. Cynthia, can you talk about how this changed federal law and how it's benefiting local law enforcement?
Sure. I think you had Dennis and Judy talk a little bit about the law, which was great. It was a good tee up to the answer. So prior to the signing of Shepard-Byrd, there was a general hate crime law that the FBI and the Department of Justice could use. And it was signed into law within the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The problem with that law is it only protected race, religion, national origin, and not other categories, which I'll get to in just a minute. But it also required the government to prove that the perpetrator purposely interfered with the victim's federally protected right. And that federally protected right is enumerated in other statutes and other laws, but that is very cumbersome. So proving not just the bias motivation, but also this interference with a protected right made using that law very difficult. And I knew that from when I was an FBI investigating hate crimes laws for 2 decades. It was a very difficult law to use. So in 2009, when Shepard-Byrd was passed, it didn't negate that law. The other law is still there, but it expanded the protections, as Dennis and Judy said. So now we have disability, sexual orientation, gender identity, and as Dennis pointed out, perception is included as well. So if you perceive someone as being gay, for example, or being transgender, even if you're wrong, it doesn't matter. It's still protected under the Shepard-Byrd law. And disability is included as well. It's worth noting that the first successful prosecution under Shepard-Byrd involved a developmentally disabled Navajo man in New Mexico, not someone who was threatened or a victim of force because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. The other thing that I would say is that this law is very helpful to state and local law enforcement in that it provides grants. So there's grant money available to help local law enforcement beef up and strengthen their hate crime investigations and reporting and collaborations with their community, which is amazing. And the last thing I would say is that just very recently, President Biden kind of tacked on sort of an extension to Shepard-Byrd when he defined lynching under federal law. So nowhere was the word lynching included in the federal criminal code. And for the first time, it is. And it is defined as a conspiracy to violate someone's civil rights under federal law. And it's tucked very neatly under Shepard-Byrd. So it did a lot for federal prosecutions, and it certainly helped our state and local friends as well.
Yeah, it sounds like it's been very, very powerful. Jamie, you're on the ground in San Francisco as an investigator working hate crimes. Can you talk about how the Shepard-Byrd Federal Hate Crimes Prevention Act has helped you?
Yes, I mean, I think for the most part, federal law, hate crime laws, and California state hate crime laws are aligned. And my office does work closely with the FBI civil rights units. The two special agents that we deal with, we're almost on a first name basis. Typically, when we have an investigation, they will reach out to us to see if there's anything that they could help and assist with. We have had them come out just to observe interviews that we've done to see if anything hits the threshold for the federal statute for them to come in to take over. So we work closely with the FBI. And again, like I said, we're on a first name basis. That's how close we are. And I think we're just fortunate in California that we do have, when I watched the video, we do have, California DOJ does require us to report our stats on a monthly basis. They're posted on our department website. We have a very robust relationship with the DA's office as well, with the vulnerable victims unit. So it's kind of all encompassing, from federal investigation to a state investigation to prosecution. We kind of cover it all. And I think we're all on the same page. I think we're fortunate in California. And I didn't know that 3 states currently don't have hate crime laws. So that to me was a little shocking. So I guess I'm lucky to live in California and work here as well.
Yeah, that's for sure. And it is surprising, especially when you think about Wyoming, which is where Matthew Shepard was murdered. Still doesn't have any hate crime laws. Becky, you and Cynthia are doing some work with the International Association of Chiefs of Police on their hate crimes subcommittee. Becky, can you talk about some of the work that this group is doing and how local law enforcement can benefit?
Absolutely. So Cynthia and I are the co-chairs of the hate crimes subcommittee for the IACP's Human and Civil Rights Committee. And we do work around, we identify programs and policies that could help enhance law enforcement's response to hate crimes. We also have developed training as well, along with Cynthia, who brings her expertise from the FBI. We worked with several federal retired prosecutors of hate crimes to develop training. And work, again, one of the things that's really important, and this has been highlighted, I think, throughout this conversation, is the importance of bringing law enforcement together in the same room with prosecutors. So they're hearing the same information. They can talk to each other about what is actually possible in terms of collecting data, collecting evidence, and what they actually need to bring a case forward. We also, one of the things we also talk about when we bring to law enforcement agencies and we can share is training specifically on how to effectively engage with communities that are often targeted for hate. You have heard time and time again that the time to, when you need a friend is not the time to make a friend. You have to have those relationships in advance, not only because it will help you to collect evidence later from the community if you need it, but also because it really does sort of help to build that baseline of trust so that people feel safe coming forward to you. It also, we talk about how you can establish rumor control mechanisms and that sort of thing when you have those relationships. it is very powerful to have someone from the community standing with you to say, this is where we are in this investigation, and to share just sort of the basic information to help to address misinformation as well. In recent years, through the subcommittee, we've also worked with civil rights leaders and others to identify and develop the model hate crimes policy that is accessible to every department across the country. It's accessible to the public if you go on the IACP website, and it identifies model policy that really does reflect the best research and the best sort of thinking about sort of how to effectively combat hate in your jurisdiction. We've also worked with civil rights organizations to develop action agendas. Those are also available for free on the IACP website. They break down really clearly, if you're a community member and you want to help support, what can you do? If you are a member of law enforcement, what can you do with community to make that more effective? And I think the other thing we do is work with other subcommittees. So for example, there's a subcommittee on constitutional policing, and we recognize that if we are to effectively address hate crimes and earn that trust, constitutional policing is critical. You can't have the kind of legitimacy that you need in order to effectively combat hate. So that's some of the work we do. We also introduce resources. I work with the state of California with the Civil Rights Department. We have a free resource line and network for people targeted for hate. We share that information so that officers never have to turn someone away empty-handed, even if it's an incident and not a crime. So those are some of the things we offer. But again, if you go to the IACP website, the model policy is free, the action agendas are free, and we are always available to sort of offer some of the training we described, as well as, and that's often in-person training, or even just sort of some technical assistance. We've got an amazing group of people on the committee that are ready to serve.
Great. Cynthia, can you speak specifically to some of the recommendations that your subcommittee has come up with for law enforcement officers around hate crimes?
Sure. I think what I would add to what Becky described in her answer is that we're here. So one of the things that we offer at no charge to law enforcement is training. So even if there's, you're a small department, you don't have training funds, or you just don't know where to start, and you go to the IACP website and you seem overwhelmed, we get it. We can come and just kind of do a site assessment and provide some training customized to your community and based on what you need. So if you want community members to come into the training, we will help you facilitate that. If you want your federal partners to come in, we'll help facilitate that. So in fact, I'm coming to you from a hotel room in New York City. We're providing training at the City University of New York tomorrow all day. So we do a lot of trainings on campuses as well, along with IACLEA. So what I would say is it's never too late to start. Even if something has happened in your community and you feel very overwhelmed and paralyzed and attacked by your community members and others, reach out to us. We can certainly help you to get your feedback on the ground and give you the resources that you need.
Fantastic. I'm starting to hear a theme emerge here. Lots of resources available, and training is key. I want to just pause for a second and invite the audience. If you have a question that emerges for you as we're talking, please put it into the chat. Our host will gather those questions up, and when we get toward the end of the program, we'll try to answer as many of them as we possibly can for you. Becky, I want to go back to you and ask about hate crimes reporting. We've already heard that it's not a requirement, but can you talk about the problem that creates, and what's the solution? How do we get this to be a requirement?
Absolutely. So I think there's a few things you've heard. I think one, as you mentioned, the FBI is required to produce a hate crimes report, but law enforcement agencies across the country are not required to report their data. Now, in some states, like Sergeant Hume was pointing out, like California, they are required to report to the Attorney General. So I'm in California. I know every law enforcement agency is required to report there. I just want to make a little note here for any departments that are also thinking about the most recent data requirements, which have to do with how you submit the data. The National Incident-Based Reporting System, or NIBRS, it's been around since 1991. It's been used by many departments to great effect because it helps you to more effectively and accurately track both the perpetrator and the victim. That said, it became the only way that the FBI said they were going to collect data in 2021. That didn't go as well because many departments hadn't made that transition. So I just put that out there to say, we know there's some transition here. We know that agencies are some of them are struggling with record management systems to get their reporting systems up to speed. But making sure, again, not only that reporting is happening, that it is happening in the way that the FBI is requesting the data is really important, because that data really does, it drives policy, it can drive how you determine where to put your resources, how do you get more resources, it's critical. I just want to note too, it was just Monday that the FBI released the data that we do have. And I think, what we know and why it needs to change is that we know the data is not accurate. I'm going to give you some numbers, and they are numbers that are important in terms of identifying trends, but they are also numbers that the very same Department of Justice that releases the data acknowledges are underreported. So just on Monday, the FBI reported a record 11,643 hate crime incidents in 2022. As the most substantial number targeting Black people. That is true since the beginning of time when we collected the data. There's been a historic rise in anti-Hispanic hate, as well as a significant increase in anti-LGBTQ hate. What I want to point out here is that we have this increase, but we are still seeing a decline in participation among law enforcement agencies that are actually reporting data. That is important. And again, as was indicated earlier, of the agencies that are reporting, I think that Brendan highlighted this, the vast majority are reporting that zero hate crime has occurred in their jurisdiction. Last year, and again, if you look at an initial review of the data from this year, less than 20% of agencies that do actually report data reported one or more hate crime. That means over 80% are saying there's no hate crimes. I'm saying all these numbers and I'm sharing them. The reason is they matter. If you live in a community and you know that people have been targeted for a hate crime in your community, it's maybe been in the news, you've seen it, and yet your agency is still reporting zero hate crimes, then it sends a message. It sends a message that they're not there to protect you. It sends a message that they're not there, that what you are experiencing doesn't matter. So I think I know how much work agencies across this country are doing to build trust. There is no quicker way to undermine that trust than to not report this kind of data. I would say just a few things really quickly about how we address it. The IACP model policy highlights a few different things that can help. One is collecting hate incident data and hate crime data. I will just give a quick plug for this and go into, you can see the details later, but with respect to incident data, it means when people come to you to report, we want to remove the burden from a victim to knowing the criminal code. They just want to know whether or not they were targeted because of who they are. If they report and it's an incident and not a crime, meaning it is an act of hate that doesn't rise to the level of a crime, more and more departments, I know in Los Angeles, I was just with detectives from LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Office, they track that data. Why? One, it helps to reduce the burden on the victim. It says, if you're reporting to it, it matters. Two, it does help later in building a case. I heard the LA County Sheriff's Department talk about how they've used that data later on to actually bring an effective and successful prosecution. And it really does help victims, help connect with victims and help connect them with resources to build trust. As I mentioned, in California, we have resources that are available to anyone targeted for hate, so that you never have to be a detective or an officer turning someone away empty-handed. You can say, this may not have been a crime, I can see it caused harm, here is a way to get actual support. We think Congress, this is one way to do this, and again, this is my own personal opinion as an individual, making it mandatory for state and local law enforcement agencies to receive federal funding to participate in the hate crime data collection. You hear that from a lot of different civil rights agencies, civil rights departments. Again, it's not an official position for me, but just to say that is one thing that people have recommended. It's going to really take a whole of society approach to address these trends. We need the right data, the actual effective and accurate data to do so. And there should also be steps to make sure it's credible. When more than 80% of departments are affirmatively reporting zero, that also undermines trust. There are ways to sort of insert, we've seen that in other federal legislation, where you can have checks on that data to make sure that it's accurate. So those are some of the things I think we can do to address it.
Yeah. Brendan, you mentioned earlier that sometimes people don't report, oftentimes victims don't report hate crimes. Is there one particular identity group or another that is less likely to report being victim of a hate crime that law enforcement should be working particularly to outreach to?
Well, I think speaking to that issue, Becky just made so many important points that drive that reporting pattern that we need to think about. I think estimating the true number of hate crimes that are not reported is really difficult, is a notoriously difficult thing to do. But our sort of best estimates both in our own research, but also, reports from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, other estimates using NCVS data indicate like somewhere to 40 to 45% of victims will report hate crime victimization to the police. But like you said, there's a lot of heterogeneity there to think about. So some researchers have argued that Black victims might be particularly unlikely to report because of the potential for strained relationships with police. The evidence for that is somewhat mixed, but there is some researchers have also argued that LGBTQ plus people might be particularly reluctant to report. And I think there's some, with each of these groups that I'm sort of highlighting, it's really important to think about there's different mechanisms operating for each group. So when we're talking about LGBTQ plus people, one of the mechanisms that's sort of specific to their decision to report is like some of them are not out about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. And that's going to impact their willingness to mobilize the criminal justice system to call the police and tell them about this incident, because that potentially risks them sharing information with the world that they weren't ready to share. I think where we're seeing the clearest trends in our research right now is among the Asian population. So our research shows that Asian victims of hate crime, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, were particularly unlikely to report victimization to the police. Sort of diving into, tapping into the mechanisms and the why is sort of the next steps, but that those are patterns that we sort of ascribe to cultural differences in private versus public preferences for help seeking that I think are really important to think about. So thinking about reporting is sort of low. There's general reluctance across the board when we're talking about hate crime victims, and I think that's because we're talking about marginalized populations that have a lot of reasons to question whether or not they want to go to the police, and there are different mechanisms for each group, and we need to be thinking sort of broad-based, across the board, how we can deal with each of these problems if we want to increase reporting, and we need to increase reporting if we want to get better at estimating the problem, and so.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned Asian American community. Jamie, obviously San Francisco has a very large Asian American population. What have you been seeing, and what's your experience been with victims of hate crime, especially in the COVID period? Are victims willing to come forward, or is it?
I think San Francisco being the diversity that it is, I believe that our department has a workforce or staffing that is also reflective of the community. We have officers who speak a multitude of different languages. I think we're blessed in that way. So, for instance, in Chinatown, we have Chinese-speaking officers who speak Mandarin and Cantonese. We have footbeat officers of Asian descent who also speak Mandarin or Cantonese. So all the different neighborhoods in the city, we have officers who speak the language, who understand the culture. And I think that's helped in people coming forward, because cultural competency is part of reaching out to the community, knowing that, like Dr. Lentz said, this group might feel marginalized, or they may have a fear of law enforcement from the country that they came from. But seeing someone that looks like them, who understands their language, who understands their culture, who's able to kind of walk them through the American legal justice system, I think that's been helpful. We did have a spike in AAPI-related hate crimes during COVID. But fortunately for us, that person is in custody. And we were able to link multiple cases to that person. It was more AAPI related, more so than COVID. So I think the best advice for local law enforcement is, again, cultural competency, understanding where your community comes from, reflecting on that. I also think that San Francisco, we have a very robust, limited English proficiency policy. If someone that we come across, we believe that they're not proficient in English, we're required to look for a translator. We're required to use the language line. We're required to request a certified translator within the department to come out. Language first and foremost is the main thing to communicate with somebody, and especially during a traumatic incident, when you can't effectively communicate, express how you feel, what happened. That's a huge part of that initial interaction between law enforcement and the victim. And just having that bridge gap by having someone understand what you're saying, understand the nuances of what you're saying, the context, that's huge.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. We talked with Judy and Dennis about the secondary victims and law enforcement's responsibility to restore a sense of safety to the community. Cynthia, let me start with you. What's your advice for local law enforcement on how to restore safety after a hate crime has happened? What should they be doing?
I think the first thing is this, and Becky and I talk about this a lot when we talk with law enforcement communities, but to me, one of the first things that should happen is a public statement. So if the law enforcement official, whoever is the highest ranking official, can tell the community as much as they can about what happened. And they can't say, we know for sure this is a hate crime. They may not know that. They may not know how it's going to be investigated and by whom. But I think the best thing they can do is to say, if it's true, the community is safe. We know the perpetrator, we have the perpetrator in custody, or the perpetrator is deceased. But first, to let the community know what's going on is honestly and transparently, I think is one of the biggest things they can do. The second thing is to assign a victim advocate to the family. And Judy mentioned this in her remarks, how she had a person with her while Dennis was overseas working. That's crucial. And if you're a small department, you don't have a victim advocate, reach out to the FBI and the Department of Justice, because they have them. And the other thing is, don't ever forget about that little known agency that is near and dear to Becky Monroe's heart, but is the Community Relations Service. They specialize in just this, in helping a community that is fractured or broken after a hate incident. So the Community Relations Service at DOJ is crucial, but also just what is that first statement that law enforcement says to the public, and can they restore that sense of safety and faith in the community?
Great advice. Jamie, what strategies have you used in San Francisco around this topic and restoring safety in a community that you found to be particularly helpful?
I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but again, in San Francisco, we have a unit called the Community Engagement Division. That unit has a multitude of officers who speak different languages. They get all the prejudice-based incident reports, hate crime incident reports. They review them. They reach out to the victims, offer services, offer resources in the same way that our district attorney's office does as well. But I think part of the issue is, again, when you're part of a marginalized community, you're not exposed, you don't understand the American legal process. And part of that is you have to go to court. You might have to testify. You might have to go to court a bunch of times. You might have to go to this courtroom. You might have to go to that courtroom. Your lawyer might change. The DA might change. Our Community Engagement Division kind of holds your hand through that process, the back end process, and tells you, okay, this is what we're going to do. You don't have a ride to court. Let me find you one, or I will take you. Okay, this is the first floor. This is courtroom 9. Okay, we've moved courtrooms to courtroom 20. Okay, I'll take you there. So I think in that way, you're not re-victimizing a victim, because now you're going through a process that you're unfamiliar with. So I think in that way, San Francisco, we're blessed in that way. I think education is the most important thing for people to understand. This is what state hate law is. Just because an incident might be transracial, that doesn't make it a hate crime. We need to explain, I need to prove that bigotry was the main motivation of why this took place, not economic, not anything else. I have to prove that bigotry was the reason why this took place. And, that education is important too. And underreporting, that's huge. Like, I need to know what's happening, whether or not you think this is minor or whatnot. We need to know, because that way we use that data to see trends. Those are all important things. And well, I didn't want to bother the police that someone graffitied my business or my window got broken. No, that's important, because all those things can be used later for an investigation as well. The more data that I have, the more data that the office has for our investigators, the stronger case that we could build.
Right. Well, training has been a central theme in our discussion this morning. IACP offers some resources around training. Cynthia, can you talk about what law enforcement officers in this country can access?
Yeah, there's some really great training that the IACP offers. Like I said, myself and our colleagues offer in-person training as well at no cost to a department. That training curriculum was developed 2017 and 18 by Becky, and we have since added to it and honed it, and we've reached over just about 2,000 officers in over 24 cities since 2018. So been very well received, and we continue to get requests to do it. So I think there's in-person training. I know Becky will talk about some online training, but it's, the best thing I could say is reach out, because there's training available, and we do the heavy lifting for you to make it easy on the departments.
At no cost, which is that magic word, right? Becky, talk about the Matthew Shepard Foundation scholarships. Judy mentioned that. What's available from an online world for training?
Absolutely. I mean, the Matthew Shepard Foundation is proud to partner with Out to Protect. And so again, Greg Moralia is the head and founder of that. And that is, again, training on how to detect, investigate, and document hate crimes. It is online, and it can help prepare first responders about recognizing and documenting and investigating hate crimes, like learning about some of the basics of state and federal hate crimes laws. And it includes all hate crimes bias motivation types, including sexual orientation and gender identity. So that's a training that, again, thanks to the Matthew Shepard Foundation, there are scholarships so that it is free for departments to use. So again, to Greg's point, that's important to note. And I think it really comes out of the foundation's commitment that you saw through Judy and Dennis to make sure that officers have what they need. Judy and Dennis have talked so many times to departments across the country about what worked and why that response was so critical. And I think they want to make sure that every family in the future has the opportunity to work with officers who have that training so that when the worst thing happens to them, they can trust that they're in good hands. So that I would say Out to Protect. And again, these scholarships are available so that online people can access this fantastic training.
Excellent. And we'll make those links available along with the ISCP links in the chat for you all. We do have a couple of questions that were submitted. One was a question specifically about, and I'll just create a little bit of a scenario here. You're an officer working in a small agency which is very typical across the US, and a hate crime happens. Who do you reach out to for help? If this is not something you're experienced with investigating before, who is the best place or the best person to reach out to for help and resources? Cynthia, do you want to take a shot at that one?
If it's an immediate sort of the immediate 911 call, I would hope that that department already has a relationship with their local FBI office. And I think Jamie talked about this, having them on speed dial, which is great, but that would always be my first call, because they're going to get you all the resources that you need virtually immediately, especially if you already have that relationship. So I would offer that you reach out to the FBI initially and have those conversations and that work start rolling. And then you can follow up or assign someone to follow up with additional resources through the IACP and some other organizations, especially like whatever the impacted community, whoever that is. So let's say the impacted community is Jewish and a Jewish person was attacked. I would definitely reach out to the ADL. If it's someone who identifies as LGBTQ, I would reach out to GLAAD and to HRC. So those definitely have to have those relationships established so that you can reach out to the impacted community as well.
Great. And this is somewhat related to that. Jamie, for you, the question is, how would you suggest officers encourage the formation of a community engagement division for their own department?
I think for San Francisco, it was just a need, and it just organically took place. I would say, as an officer of a small department, I mean, resources are always going to be limited. I mean, resources limited for us here in San Francisco as well. I mean, and sometimes you have to take on that dual role. And I think part of that guardian mindset that we have in law enforcement is, there's a need here. And I think this is what we need to do. I'm willing to volunteer to be a part of that. I think that's what it takes. It just kind of takes us to step up to do it, because there's a need that needs to be filled. And we as cops, we're used to that. We're used to doing multiple things, things that we didn't sign up to do and we end up doing. I think organically, that's just one of the things that if a department sees a need in that, and that need will be filled.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we've seen across the country community liaison positions be created because someone in the agency, someone in the rank and file steps up and says, I want to be that representative for the law enforcement agency. And there are some really great models out there in large agencies and in very small agencies. So it's not about size of the department. Any department can engage in that important work. Another question, we've got a couple minutes here that I'll throw out. This is a question about the rates of arrest and conviction. We have some preliminary data on reported hate crimes, but then what does it look like in terms of data for those arrested and then those convicted? Brendan, you want to take a stab at that one?
Sure. Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I think when we're thinking about arrest and conviction after a hate crime is reported, we really have to think of it. It's very difficult to estimate, and it's difficult to estimate because we have to think about it in terms of there's three outputs, right? So the one output is, the no arrest and no prosecution. The other is a successful hate crime arrest and hate crime prosecution. But there's this modal category that happens in between that's really common, where the hate crime is reported and it is investigated as a hate crime, but the eventual prosecution will end up being for the underlying crime itself and not for and not the accompanying hate crime charge. So it's really difficult to estimate. But something that Becky said earlier, I think really resonated with this problem for me. And that's, she mentioned that we have to get officers and prosecutors in a room together. And there's this, and that speaks to this issue that we identify in the research pretty consistently, is this issue of what we call prosecutorial decoupling, where we have this lack of communication back and forth between law enforcement officers and prosecutions. And when we talk about hate crimes, it's in terms of who's doing what. Right. So there's this element of prosecutors assuming that law enforcement are doing the work up front to identify whether or not something is a hate crime. And then there's the question of law enforcement thinking that prosecutors might follow up on this. And then we have this sort of these cases that fall through the cracks. Right. So I think that's difficult to estimate, but that's the core problem if we want to get those rates up, to my mind.
Excellent. Well, we are already out of time. So I want to start by thanking all of our panel members today, our subject matter experts who came in and shared their time, with special thanks to the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund for hosting this program and making it available. It will be available for rebroadcast or reuse in a podcast, videocast form. So thank you all for attending today and for your interest, and stay safe.
And for my part, on behalf of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund, I'd like to thank Greg Moralia, the Shepards, and all of our esteemed panels for today's very poignant discussion. We at the National Law Enforcement Museum aim to have discussions about topics that strike a chord, not only with our law enforcement audience, but also with the communities that our law enforcement officers serve. So we invite you to check out some of our past programs right on our website at lawenforcementmuseum.org. And if any of you find yourself in Washington, D.C. and would like to come visit what really is a world-class museum right here in Washington, D.C. and our very sacred memorial, please take time to do that. Until then, thank you again for watching and stay safe.